Greetings, Derek with DGA Tech here. I am a mess, of course, but guess what? So is a lot of things. Alright, the topic today is the Linux kernel. So, there's a lot of people who I've noticed are talking about security vulnerabilities and all this because there's a lot of new users that are influxing to the platform. Here's the thing. Being that I've been paying attention over the years and how things have been changing, there is a missing element of common sense that used to be talked about quite often to do with this topic. And what that common sense topic is the concept that a book author develops a book, they write the basic schematic for a main character, maybe another main character, maybe another one. They leave out details. They write a main storyline. They create a transcript. They share it with a friend. The friend looks it over and goes, oh my gosh, there's all these glaring errors. This word's misspelled. That word's misorganized. That sentence isn't in the correct form. You missed this or that detail of this or that character. But they don't point it out because they know the author is sitting there. They're still thinking about it. It's not a finished product. They're continually developing it, and they're going to go back and look it over. They probably left those errors in the text as mnemonic references to remind themselves to develop on that logic, which is part of a much broader, not yet typed in or written in intellectual concept that they want to build into the storyline. And if someone were to point it out as an error, they would just assume, oh yeah, I was probably wrong, and tie off the loose end and not develop it into the idea that they previously had because the node was referenced as an error rather than as a potential building ground upon which the continuation of logic could develop into an entirely new storyline that would be part of the whole story and add to its character, depth, originality, and overall beauty. Or intellectuality, you name it. Apply that concept to the Linux kernel. When you sit there and you point out, use AI to scan for things that could be considered security vulnerabilities from the perspective of if it was a Mac OS or a Windows feature, because Mac OS is sold as a interconnected linkage with existing hardware, as it's designed to not have the expectation that there's going to be security vulnerabilities or that there's going to be unfinished logics. New features are seen as novel concepts to add on to it that it's like you didn't really have to do that. It's just someone took the time to develop a new feature and added it to the existing finished product and released it as an update or as a extension to the system. Same logic on Windows. With its automatic updates, they have a different perspective on the matter. Well, Linux is community software. It's developed by the community, for the community, by the people who develop it. So Linux has a sensitive side to it. If you sit there and you point out every single built-in mnemonic reference hook upon which the idea of that hook being left there was so that way later on a new developer who maybe had a unique perspective that didn't exist at the time the feature was built initially could look at it and go, oh my gosh, this looks like a security vulnerability, but if I look at the logic of the way the code is structured, it clearly indicates that a whole new feature could be built onto this node, not to close the security vulnerability, but to add in a whole nother feature of logical capability to the Linux kernel by making use of that node, of which could have been chopped off as a security vulnerability. Okay? Loose ends in the Linux kernel because it's an ongoing development project which is built to be developed. and to continuously evolve over time. The purpose is not to tie off nodes. The purpose is to build on the existing feature sets with where there's loose ends to hook in new features. That's the idea behind it. At least in my perspective, from what I can tell. It's part of the reason that makes Linux so fun to use. You sit there on Mac OS or Windows using your finished product, and things start to feel difficult. It starts to feel like you have an idea you want to do, but there's no way to do it. You switch over to Linux and you go, oh my gosh, there's all these different features and ways to do things that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. That's because it's an ongoing development project. There's loose ends you can tie into that allow you to fabricate a proof of concept application that wouldn't run on a production hardware system. So that way you can take that proof of concept and develop it eventually into an idea that doesn't make use of those original idea hooks, and then you'll have a working application that's maybe ready for production in the mainstream, and then maybe you cross-develop it to other platforms. A lot of those loose ends in the Linux kernel are there as mnemonic reminders when developing an application of like, alright, I was going to develop it this way, but then I saw that there is that particular security vulnerability in the Linux kernel that reminded me that if I develop that part of that application that way, it won't be as efficient as if I develop it this other way, and I program the application to work around that concept, reminding you of all these other features and methods of development that you otherwise wouldn't have encountered. But if you close all of the security vulnerabilities in the Linux kernel, you never encounter those errors. It never occurs to you to think those thoughts. You never end up doing those refinements. The application doesn't develop the same way it would have, so on and so forth. Which is why there's probably a good idea to have perhaps, since there's a larger number of users using Linux than ever before, and the target audience is wider than it's ever been before, perhaps a version of Linux that is designed for developers and a version of Linux that is designed for end users. If that were to occur, then the one for end users, yeah, you could go out of your freaking mind, sitting there, closing security vulnerabilities, tying up all the loose ends, so it's a single piece of production hardware that never makes you question a single thing about anything you ever do on the platform, so that way nothing ever develops beyond what you yourself choose to do without any sort of mnemonic reminders to remind you to develop anything at all. It's just for media consumption or reading books or watching movies or doing pre-made activities for you. Versus then there'd be the version for developers that is full of loose ends, has unending sea of security vulnerabilities, but somehow makes it all work in that one particular way that when you develop an application, there's all these mnemonic reminders that remind you, okay, I don't want to develop it this way, I want to develop it that way. That person used that logic of leaving that security vulnerability open to remind me that that's a security vulnerability method that exists, so that way I don't re-implement it in this existing application because that and so on and so forth, so that you can develop production hardware and all this by going via the development pathway of writing your own code or so on and so forth. Alright, and so there could be a version that's for vibe coders that has perhaps a different logic that is for vibe coding, or so on and so forth. The idea is that these things would be implemented by the operating system's implementation of how it implements the operating system that makes use of the Linux kernel, however. So the idea was that the Linux kernel is released as the bare metal like developer level understanding. Then you build the operating system with all the different applications that include security patches to tie up loose ends to make it look like a production operating system in the specific combination that you want to use to make your operating system behave in a certain fashion and be usable in a certain way. So closing those security vulnerabilities is limiting the scope of creative possibilities that developers of operating systems have to use to when creating new distros or variants of their operating system. It's really all security vulnerability closing can do on Linux kernel level, on the bottom level there, is restrict the creativity of the community. However, if there was perhaps a layer above the Linux kernel that's below the operating system that would be perhaps the security layer, that might make sense. Like you would in Linux, everything's a file. So if you've got the Linux kernel and the initial RAM disk, perhaps what you're really looking at is the bootloader and the perhaps systemd, right? The thing that the Linux, so the bootloader has to be secure, so that way when your system's booting up, it's secure as a boot process. So that's got its stuff. The Linux kernel is meant to be as free to do whatever it wants as humanly possible. The idea of tricking it into doing things, well, that's supposed to be negated by the applications that it loads that act as a barrier between the Linux kernel and the rest of the applications. That's the security layer. That's should be a separate file. A separate file that is the security vulnerability prevention, vulnerability execution prevention layer. Security vulnerability execution prevention layer. There's a file that was specifically for that specific purpose, separate from the Linux kernel. Then the Linux kernel could have as many loose ends as it wants, and the prevention layer, its whole duty would be to prevent applications from exploiting the Linux kernel with a workaround that developers can use to be able to tie into those hooks to make it do all kinds of cool things. I mean, this would be useful for a production operating system. But for developers, I don't know, a lot of developers like to have loose ends that they can tie into to extend the functionality, do cool tricks with their computer they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So I don't know, it just seems weird when I start hearing people talking about security vulnerabilities in the Linux kernel, because this used to be kind of universally understood that the Linux kernel is my logic stopped there. Alright. Because I can't speak for the whole community. I don't know jack shit. You kidding me? But, yeah.